Thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I learnt two things in your speech. The first is that Prince Albert of Monaco is flying here on his private jet, which is good news for me because I hope I'm able to hitch a lift home on Saturday. And Wilfred, you did also concede another piece of information, which I'm sure came as a huge surprise to people sitting in this room tonight, that you and Annie have been married 45 years. It is very, very obvious to me, Annie, that you were a child bride when you accepted the invitation to join Wilfred. Wilfred, first of all, let me thank you again for the invitation to be here tonight. It's a delight for any number of reasons. It's a delight as a former Member of Parliament to be in a city and feel welcomed as a former British Member of Parliament. It's also a delight for me to be here and in a country that provided such extraordinary athletes in my formative years, because, as you know, we're going to go back down memory lane a little bit tonight, but the athletes that I grew up in, certainly in the late 60s and the early 70s, were athletes that bestrode the distance world at that time. Gaston Rollins, Carl Lismont, Emil Puttermans. These were great athletes for somebody trying to learn their trade. And of course, the athlete that we're here to celebrate tonight was the fourth athlete in that quartet, that even though snatched from you and your country and from our sport at such a ridiculously young age, made such a huge impact on me and my coaching team. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. The only person I wish were here tonight was my father, Peter Coe, who was my coach. And the reason I wish he were here tonight is not just because this is a meeting that he really loved to be at, but he also had a hidden passion. For those of you who thought he was my coach, that's what he did in his sort of waking hours. But his passion was cycling. His hero was Eddie Merckx, who Wilfred arranged for him to meet late on in his life. And on the eve of my retirement in 1990, he was surrounded by some British journalists, and anybody that knew my father, and Wilfred and Sven certainly knew him well. He was not somebody that felt particularly comfortable around journalists, and one of them said to him, "Peter, do you have any regrets?" And he said, "Yes, my son never won the Tour de France," which they certainly found slightly confusing. And the reason that I'm most pleased to be here is that in 24 hours' time, we are celebrating not just the life of an extraordinary athlete, but the creation of a meeting that marked the life of that extraordinary athlete. Let me digress just for a few moments, because I think we can all probably agree that in one way or the other, it is the human condition to ponder the passage of time. I always remember my father once saying to me he never quite understood where the years between the age of 40 and 70 went. They just flew past, and largely because he was engaged in such a frenetic activity, which is coaching. And I guess if I extend that analogy, I find it bizarre that it is 4 years ago and 2 Olympic Games ago that we witnessed those extraordinary scenes in London. We've, of course, since then been to Sochi and to Rio. It was 11 years ago that London snuck across the line in Singapore to win the right to stage the greatest prize in sport. It was 17 years ago that 3 of us sat in a pub off the King's Road in West London, daring to dream and assuming that it wasn't such a crazy idea for us, three of us, to throw our hats in the ring and hope that London might stage the Games. And if I continue in that vein, those three people who were sitting in that pub that night in 1999, a few years later became 8,500 people at the opening ceremony of the London Games. And if I continue, and don't worry, I will get to the point in a moment, if I continue in that vein, it is 32 years ago that I was last in an Olympic city as an athlete, 36 years ago that I was first in an Olympic city as an athlete, Los Angeles and Moscow. And it is now 40 years ago that I sat in my sitting room in Sheffield. I was brought up in the north of England, in what we refer locally as the People's Republic of South Yorkshire. And I sat there with my training partners from the Hallamshire Harriers, a well-known local club that had won, by that stage, 7 national cross-country titles, had had Olympic athletes that had competed as far back as 1924, and the last time that there was the cross-country relays in Paris in the Olympic Games that year. And I remember sitting late into the evening and marveling with my coach, my father, and the other athletes, some older than me, about the extraordinary talent of a man that had emerged a few years earlier on the scene as an 800-meter runner, marveling at the raw physical presence of Alberto Wantarena. And then a few days later, the same group came together late into the evening because of the time change. And again, watching and marveling at the extraordinary talent that won the 1,500 meters. John Walker, who graced the stadium here on so many occasions. And my father, who was an engineer, always absorbed and listened, and always, like any good engineer, understood the maxim of why use one word when none will do. And at the end of the 1,500 meters, he very quietly turned to me and said, "The person that will be a big problem for you is not the winner of the 800 meters, and he's not the winner of the 1,500 meters, it's the guy that has finished second, because he can do both those distances, and that he will be your biggest challenge in Moscow in 4 years' time." And anybody that knew my father knew that he didn't lightly make observations off the back of a fag packet. They were thought through. And I always remember that observation. And I always remember the kid who would cause me the big problem. And I didn't, in my wildest dreams, believe that 1 year later I would be in the stadium, not only racing for the first time at international level, but also in a meeting to celebrate his life, sadly snatched from you and our sport and your country at such a tragically young age. And Wilfred, let me tonight pay tribute to you, because I know from long experience of pulling together a project that took, in my case, over 13 years, that there are no happy accidents on the night. It is not the management if it'll be all right on the night. The Van Damme meeting, born of optimism and then of tragedy, and then creating such an extraordinary jewel in the crown in our athletic circuit, is something that you and your team and Annie should take great credit from and great pride in, because it is an extraordinary construct that you bequeathed off the back of an extraordinary talent to our sport. That was 40 years ago. And it was 40 years ago that I emerged as a penniless student in Brussels at your invitation. I remember one of the more amusing moments when I had confused the exchange rate. I was still a novice enough to believe that my expenses would come in pounds, not in dollars. And I remember sitting with you and a few of your colleagues arguing over the exchange rate. It was probably about £4.50, but as a penniless student, that was probably a meal the following week. And Roger Moen sitting there and taking an avuncular view of this and saying, Wilfred, give him the money. I think he's going to be good one day. Well, 5 years later, I was back in your stadium breaking a world record. So thank you, Roger, for my £4. Thank you, Roger and Wilfred, for my £4.50. And as I often introduce you and Sven Arne Hansen to my children with the words, please thank these two gentlemen because they actually educated you and put you through school. So thank you very much for your continued pastoral care. It was 40 years ago. We were different people. It was a different world. I jotted down a few things that were happening in 1977. I hope this sort of has a few reminiscences. Apple produced its first computer. Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States, replacing Gerald Ford. The Times of London announced quite proudly on its front page that punk was officially dead. As a jazz fan, I was slightly more concerned that year with the fact that Errol Garner and the sublime Paul Desmond had died. The shuttle had its first test flight. Star Wars was first on our screens, the highest grossing film of all time. I know Saturday Night Fever also made its premiere, a favourite of yours, Annie and Wilfred's, but we won't go into that any further. British Airways announced its first transatlantic Concorde flight. And sadly, Elvis Presley died. I think he died, actually, the day of or the day before the first Van Damme meeting. And for those of you who are of an economic bent, the average cost of a house was $49,000 and the average salary $15,000. I think that's probably enough of a walk down memory lane. I'm a great jazz fan. I'm also a great lover of the Great American Songbook, so I am, in those memories, reminded of the wonderful song, These Foolish Things Remind Me of You. Well, those foolish things remind me of you, they remind me of me, and they remind me of us. And since then, the Memorial Van Damme has found a place at the epicenter of our sport. I thought it was 13 world records. I was corrected by Wilfred tonight. It's 14. 6 of them still remain on the books, and some of them are absolutely sublime and will probably remain on the books for some time. I was here when Kanessa Bekele broke the 10,000. I was here when I saw my own 4x800 meter world record disappear. And I know that this event has captured the imagination, it has enthralled, it has excited, it has impacted, it has imprinted, and it has above all inspired. And I know that because I was reading a quote from Tia earlier today that said that it was with a group of school children that she came here on a bus. She even took part in the Mexican wave, and it was those moments that inspired her to become the athlete she is, and of course the celebrated Olympic champion from 2008. And I will go to my grave knowing that these events are events that change the lives of young people. They change the lives of young people, they change the lives of athletes, and they change the lives of local communities. And I also know that your history at the Van Damme is our history, and our sport has borrowed very heavily from the Van Damme meeting. I can't think, probably alongside Oslo and Zurich, that those memories that have added luster to those indelibly etched iconic visions and memories that are now residing in the collective memory of our sport. I can't think of events where we've borrowed more heavily. And for those reasons, I want to be at the 60th anniversary of the Van Damme. I hope accompanied by my grandchildren, who I hope are actually involved in the sport, unlike my other four, who are field hockey players. I want to be here to celebrate 3 generations' time, the types of athletes that continue to be inspired by that meeting. And I want to do it in a stadium that has a fully fledged track and field facility. And I know we live in a world of economic balance and reality and accountability, and balanced budgets and strong, compelling cases that need to be challenged to prosper. But we must also make sure that we never lose sight of our need to be proud and protective of our history and our heritage, and not just living in a world, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, where we know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Athletics, in its greatest manifestation, is an extraordinary sport. It's an extraordinary sport, and it has gilt-edged the history of this country. It needs an extraordinary stage to continue to add luster, and that stage should be in this great city. I know that there are deliberations to be made. I was for a number of years a jobbing politician, and even for a shorter period of time a minister. I know the pressures, I know the strains, I know the priorities. But let me fall back and heavily borrow from another part of the great American songbook. The words of the great Ira and George Gershwin in that great number, "Oh no, please don't take that away from us. Don't take that away from me. Don't take that away from this city." It is absolutely vital that athletics is celebrated at its highest level. It is celebrated in large populations, and it is celebrated by populations that understand and are passionate about our sport. And if we can continue to do that, then it makes my life as the president of this great sport a darn sight easier. Wilfred, thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight.